Hey guys, what is going on? It is Brooke, or the Undead DM, back at it again with another video. And before we get started, I'd like to say Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. If you are watching this on Thanksgiving. If you aren't, well, I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. And if it's coming up, well, have fun with that. But today in this episode, I'm going to be going over the subclasses for the Sculptor, the rest of the subclasses, what I think of them, and just general how they balance. Now, I did try to record this 2 other times, but unfortunately the first one didn't capture audio, and the second one I got caught up with real life business, but let's hope we can get it done this time. So without further ado, let's get started. So last time I covered the base class and the first class here, the shape of the axe. I went over why the class just wasn't that good as a martial. The best part, honestly, was the spell list selection, in the terms of it gets the choice of between ranger and sorcerer, which is pretty good. But not having access to any weapons and any armor you want is a little bit restrictive. Now, the first one here is the shape of the bow. So the first one you get is Mobile Battalion, where your weapon becomes a longbow, and you ignore the heavy property if you're smaller, which, like I've said before in the previous recordings, that this is basically ignored by most DMs because most DMs find it stupid that races don't have longbows for their own races. Like, why can't a gnome society create a longbow for gnomes? It's a bit dumb. But if your DM's that kind of person, this might help with that. Alert Archer. The problem with Alert Archer that I found is not the fact that it gives your intelligence modifier to your initiative rolls. It's the fact that it says you cannot be surprised except by magical means. Now, my question is, what constitutes a magical means? So when I ask that question, people think, well, no duh, invisible, like invisibility spell, the greater invisibility spell, no duh. But then, like, what about Pass Without Trace? Pass Without Trace just gives you a +10 bonus to stealth. And you can't be tracked except unless you want to. So, does that count as magical means? If it does, what makes it different than a normally high stealth check? And if it doesn't, why not? You used a spell to do it. So it's a bit weird. If it just acted like the alert feat where you just can't be surprised, it'd be better. Quick shot. This is just crossbow expert, but for your shape weapon. So if you attack using your action, you can use a bonus action to make an attack with your bow. But the difference is that instead of attacking anyone that you want, like with crossbow expert, you specifically have to attack a creature you attacked with your shape weapon on your action. It's a little bit restrictive and it doesn't really increase your damage all that much, but it is helpful. And missile guidance, once per each of your turns, when you make an attack, you can make it at advantage, and the range of your Artisan's Eye ability is increased to 60 feet. Now, Artisan's Eye, in case you guys didn't see the previous video, which I will link in the description, is an ability that you could target a creature within 30 feet and focus on them, and they can't be hidden from you except by magical means. You crit on a 19 to 20, and you gain advantage on investigation, nature, and insight checks. So instead of 30 feet, it's now 60 feet. This subclass is very, very weak. It doesn't really offer much in terms of damage. It doesn't really offer much in terms of utility. The abilities are kind of worded weirdly. The first ability in Mobile Ballistician is very weak, as it doesn't give you any sort of damage increase or any unique ability other than that. Our Alert Archer is just worst alert feat. Quick Shot is just more restrictive crossbow expert, and Missile Guidance is just worse reckless attack, but for ranged weapons. And if you wanted this, you could just go one level into Rogue, or however many levels into Rogue to get steady aim, and then just do that instead. If you don't move and you're using a ranged weapon, you get advantage for free. Why not take it? Overall, this entire thing just needs to be worked on. Next up is shape of the hammer, where your weapon becomes a maul. It ignores the heavy property, and it counts as a heavy weapon for the Great Weapon Master feat. Which I don't know why ignoring the feature if you're a small race would not count as Great Weapon Master viable, but whatever. Don't need to have that. So Line Breaker is Crusher. It's essentially the Crusher feat from Tasha's Cauldron. Whenever you hit a creature with your shape weapon, you can push them up to 10 feet away, but the one difference is that a creature pushed move, cannot be pushed if there are no unoccupied spaces within range. So why this is a worse Crusher is that I believe it's either in the player's handbook or the Dungeon Master's guide that if a creature is pushed and there is no other space to go into, so for instance, if you are 10 feet away from a wall and a creature casts a spell that pushes you 20 feet, you can only move that 10 feet before the wall stops you. I don't remember which book it's in, but I'm almost certain that there is a rule in there that states that for every 5 feet you are unable to move when being forcefully moved, you take an additional d6 damage of bludgeoning damage because you're being pushed. It's either bludgeoning or force, or it's dependent on the situation, like the DM says. But it's a bit weird that if they don't have room, it just doesn't work. Meaning, if you wanted to use this and they were only like 5 feet away from a wall, you couldn't use this. It's a bit strange. I'd remove it and maybe make the pushing a bit better than Crusher. But then again, if you stack this with Crusher, that'd be pretty interesting. Because Crusher pushes them 10 feet away when you use a bludgeoning weapon, and this pushes them 10 feet away when using a bludgeoning weapon. So you could potentially push them 20 feet away, which is fine. So, Mana Infusion. This is the one ability that's actually pretty good in the subclass, next to its final ability, where it increases the weapon damage from 2d6 to 2d10, meaning it's got an average increase of 4 damage per attack with it. And considering how you are a half-caster with 2 attacks, it's actually pretty good. And also, you have an ability that can change the damage type. I don't know if it's as a bonus action. When you sculpt your weapon, and with the ability, you can sculpt your weapon as an action, as a reaction whenever you roll initiative, or as a bonus action, you could sculpt your mana weapon. Meaning you can essentially deactivate it, use a bonus action to sculpt your weapon again, and change the damage type. So having a 2d10 like radiant damage against a lich for each of your attacks is actually pretty good. Bring down the hammer. Basically, you slam the ground in an area within 30 feet of you becomes difficult terrain, and each creature within that area other than you must make a strength save or take 8d6 bludgeoning, or take 8d6 damage of the shape weapon type and be knocked prone, half as much on success and not be knocked prone. And each 5-foot square of the area takes at least a minute to clear, and you can only use this once per long rest. So, as we know, Fireball is a pretty strong spell, but getting it at 15th level is a bit weak. If this was maybe like the 11th level feature, or bring down the hammer was made in tandem with mana infusion, that would be a lot. It wouldn't be good, but it'd be better. But then again, the difficult terrain does help, so maybe 11th level would be more appropriate, and then get a new 15th level ability. But so far, the damage of a fireball at 15th level is a bit weak. Now, Shape of the Shield is actually by far one of the best subclasses, because you get a shield as your weapon. It deals a d10 bludgeoning damage as a melee weapon. And on top of that, you also get proficiency with simple weapons. one of only two subclasses in this form, in this PDF, that actually gives you proficiency in something else. So then we got impromptu battlements. Basically, you could take your shield and dig it into the ground, and you create a 4 foot tall, 15 foot long area of half cover. And you can't use your shield weapon while it's entrenched, but you can just pick it up, and that's it. Granted, it takes your action to both place it and pick it back up, but that's not really much of a problem when we get to later levels. But if it was a bonus action, it'd be a little bit better. But yeah, essentially, you can make a 1 by 3 foot area, so 1 block, so 5 feet, vertically, and then 15 feet horizontally. You can make that into a piece of half cover for your allies, giving them +2 bonus to AC, which is pretty good. It's pretty okay. And then you also get charging bulwark, where if you move at least 20 feet while you're holding your shield, and you hit with a melee weapon using your shield, you can have the creature that you hit make a strength save or be knocked prone, and you could do this intelligence modifier a number of times per long rest. The only thing is, I'd probably reduce it to 15 feet, and I would make it so that this is intelligence modifier per short or long rest rather than just long rest. Because even if they succeed, nothing happens, and that's just a waste of it. Hardened focus at 11th level. You add your intelligence modifier to concentration checks, which is pretty good. So basically, yeah, you just make a d20 roll with your constitution and your intelligence if you're concentrating on a spell, which is pretty good because if you're going something like ranger and you have favored foe and it's considered concentrating as if you were concentrating on a spell, this works too. You also get crushing bulwark, where whenever you use charging bulwark and they fail, I don't even think they have, yeah, when you knock a creature prone, so when a creature fails to save for charging bulwark, you can make an attack against them. And in case you don't know, prone creatures, they grant all melee creatures advantage on attack rolls against them, which is pretty good. And then improved impromptu battlements. When you use your action to entrench your weapon from impromptu battlements, you can create a copy of your shield, and you can carry this shield around with you like you would normally, using your charging bulwark and your crushing bulwark. And the original entrenched shield remains for 1 minute, once per short or long rest, which is really all you need. You really only need it once per short or long rest. I think this is by far one of the best subclasses for it, as it kind of shores up some of the weaknesses of the class, but also really hones in on its strengths and compounds them. It also shores up its own weaknesses later on. Granted, improved impromptu battlements would have been better as like an 11th level ability, but I can understand why they put it to 15th. They just needed something there. I think all you need to do is just kind of rearrange some of the abilities and maybe add an additional one, and we would be a-okay. Trident is one of the other better ones, not because of what it's doing with its abilities, but because, as far as I'm aware, this is the only other subclass that actually gives you proficiency in something outside of what your base class has. So you get Hoplite Tactician, where you obviously get a trident, and it changes from a d6 to d8 one-handed, and from a d8 to a d10 two-handed. And you also gain the reach property, which is pretty good. You also, at level 1, get proficiency with shields. So once again, you get proficiency with shields, which, in case you didn't know, you don't get as a sculptor by default. You only get all armors. Now, this is where the trident gets a little bit weird. Hold the line. So, as a bonus action, you could choose a creature 20 feet away from you, and if that creature moves into your space on its turn, you can use your reaction to attack it, and it takes an additional D8 piercing damage if you're one-handing it, or D10 if you're two-handing it. But if it takes the disengage action, you don't get to make that attack. So this is strange because your reach is never going to be 20 feet. Your range is at most going to be 10 feet. And if you are using this in its most predictable circumstance, where you're door dodging and you are the only person in the doorway and they have to get past you in order to get into the room, you could only stab one creature. And on top of that, it doesn't work if the creature doesn't move into your range. That's very important. Because it says right here, if a creature moves within your shape weapon range, if that creature moves right here, not if it's already in it, but if it goes from where your 10-foot reach is and it moves anywhere in that, then you can make the attack. But if it's already there and it moves within it, doesn't count. I would just say choose a creature, and if they come within, or hell, just give them the sentinel feat, like a creature that enters your reach. You can hit them with a reaction attack, even if they took the disengage action. Maybe also reduce their speed to 0. Just basically give them the sentinel feat at 6th level. Flexible sculpt. Basically, once on your turns, when you miss with a weapon attack, using your trident, you can make another weapon attack as part of the same action. So it's essentially an additional extra attack, but only if you miss. Which is not really granting you an extra attack, it's more granting you advantage on a missed attack. Kind of like the lucky feat, but only for weapon attacks, and only once per turn. And tactical targeting. When you hit a creature with an attack using your shape weapon, you can choose to mark them, and when you or an ally, you mark them until the end of your next turn. And when you or an ally hits them, they take an additional d6 damage of your weapon's damage type, and you can mark a number of creatures equal to your intelligence modifier per long rest. Now here's the thing that's very interesting. It doesn't say you can only mark one creature. It just says whenever you hit a creature, meaning you can mark more than one. Which is nice, but not really necessary considering how it's only once. This is good. This would only really be good if you're not focus firing, which you should be. But even then, it says when you or an ally, meaning if you hit them with the first one, mark them, and then you hit them with your extra attack, it consumes it by the time you get your extra attack. Which is a bit interesting, but I guess it's fine for like an extra bit of burst damage. Just like a little extra bit. But this would just be more useful if it says when an allied creature, this way they get the additional burst damage, so you're more of a supportive damage. But that's just me. I think this just needs to have more of an identity as opposed to just being trident. Because it seems like it's going everywhere. It doesn't know what it wants to be. It doesn't know if it wants to be a doorway tank, a damage buffer, a sort of frontline damage dealer. It doesn't know what it wants to be here. And finally, shape of the twin blades. They become a sword in each hand. Basically, they are just a scimitar. You can engage in 2-weapon fighting. Same as usual. They count as 2 weapons for dual wielder. At 6th level, you get Dancer's Defense. Basically, when a melee attack would hit you, While you're holding your shaped weapon, you can use your action to add your proficiency to your AC, and if the attack misses and the creature's within 5 feet of you, you can make an attack against them, and you can use this intelligence modifier a number of times per long rest. The problem I have with this ability is that they have to be within 5 feet. So, if for whatever reason you're playing a bugbear with this, not anything against bugbears, something against this class in general, but if for whatever reason you're playing this class, and your bugbear has a reach of an additional 5 feet, and you're holding your two scimitars, which now have a range of 10 feet, they have to be within 5 feet of you. It doesn't matter that they're in your reach, they have to be within 5 feet. If this just said within your reach, it wouldn't be that much of a problem, but even then, it's still not a good ability, even with just if they're within your reach. Dance partners. So, to understand this, it's very important to understand the ability that it's referencing. So, Mana Artist, whenever you shape your weapon, you could choose Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, Necrotic, or Radiant damage, and your weapon becomes that damage type. So, if you chose Fire, instead of your sword dealing slashing damage, and then dealing an additional bit of fire on top of that, it just does all fire damage. With Dance Partners, it allows you to have each of your swords do a different damage type when you manifest them from that list. And whenever you attack with one, it does an additional damage die of elemental damage based on the other sword and its damage die. So, a scimitar does a d6 damage. If you have one scimitar of fire and one scimitar of ice, if you hit with your scimitar of fire, it does a d6 fire damage, but then it also does an additional d6 cold damage because of your other scimitar. And vice versa. If you hit with a cold, it does an additional d6 fire. So it's a bit weird on how it's worded, but once you understand how it's meant to work, it makes sense. It's a fine ability. It essentially adds an additional 3 points of damage on average to your DPR on each of your attacks, which is fine. It's fine, but it still relies on you hitting, so it's not all that good. I would have preferred something like you can use a bonus action to attack a number of times equal to your intelligence or your proficiency or something like that. But, yeah. And Dance of Death. So, as an action, you make 4 attacks against a creature. And once all 4 attacks are done, they have to make a con save or become stunned for a minute. Mind you, you don't have to hit every single one, you just have to make 4 attacks. Once the 4 attacks are made, they make a con save against your spell save DC, and if they fail, they are stunned for a minute. However, if you hit all 4 of those attacks, they make the con save at disadvantage, but they can also make subsequent saves at the end of their turns to end the effect early, and it can only be used once per short or long rest. It's not a strong ability, but it's not a weak one either. This is in the meh range. It could be good if it was just made better. And I think what's making it a little bit better is that it's not required that you do damage with each attack, just that you attempt to. And that you hit with each of the attacks. So for instance, if we go back to Dance Partners, you can choose 2 different damage types. But if you choose to keep the same damage type for each, and you happen to be going against a creature that has immunity to that damage type, and you hit all 4 of your attacks, even though you have done 0 damage, you still get this effect. A little bit of a restriction I think I would add is if you hit all 4 and you deal damage. This way you can't just cheese it out like going against a red dragon and then doing this with fire weapons and being like, well, I technically hit, I just didn't do any damage. So, Dance of Death goes off. It might be a little bit of a nerf, but then I'll obviously buff it to compensate. Maybe that the creature being hit by it can't use legendary resistance, they don't have their modifier, something like that. Because at this point, a con save at this point, with the creatures you're going to be fighting at this level, that's never going to happen. You are never going to get a successful spell or effect off that requires a strength, con, or dex save. And if you do, it's either because they ran out of legendary resistance, they have immunity to whatever you're trying to do, or the DM just rolled really, really badly. Or he's one of those DMs who feels bad for you because they rolled another 18 and they know with the modifiers it's going to be like a 32 and they don't want you to feel useless, so they say it fails just to make you feel better. But who would do that? Either way, I think the best subclass here is obviously the shield. The shield is pretty good. It covers its own weaknesses. I'd say the second best would probably be the hammer. It's not very good, but it at least is something. I'd say in the middle. In the middle would probably be the. I'd say maybe the axe. Like, I'd say the axe is probably in the middle. It's not good, it's not bad. And then below that would probably be the trident, then the twin blades, and then the bow. The bow just has a lot of problems. It's just way too weak for what it's trying to accomplish. And then finally, the prerequisites here are a bit strange. So, you have to have either strength or dex, and then intelligence. So, in case you don't know how multiclassing works, you not only have to meet the prerequisites of the class you're going into, but also your own class. Meaning, if you're a wizard with 12 intelligence, you can't multiclass at all. Because you have to meet the wizarding prerequisite of multiclassing of 13 intelligence. So that means not only do you have to have either strength or dex at 13, but then intelligence on 13. And then in order to multi-class into it, you have to have your own class's prerequisite of 13 and 13. Meaning this could potentially turn into a 4 ability score reliant multi-class if you wanted to go this route. That is if you didn't go something like Fighter. Fighter, Barbarian, Wizard, pretty much anything that only has 1. But overall, I think the class needs a lot of work in the martial side. It needs a better spell selection on the half-caster side. And also just some general reworking of some of the subclasses, upping the damage, making them more useful, making them more usable more times per short or long rest. Just giving some of the abilities the ability to be used on short or long rests a number of times per short or long rest. Intelligence, proficiency bonus, doesn't matter. Buffing the bow in general. Think of the shield, take shape of the shield, and just make everything else equivalent to that in power. Give it something. Give each class, subclass something. Make it based around it, and then improve upon with each level. Instead of giving it random abilities that kind of fit the theme. Give it a very clear identity as to what it's meant to do, what you are meant to do in combat, and then improve upon it. But giving it enough variety that you can actually do other things than what is set in stone. Because with the shield, you can put up a barrier and do nothing, Or you can charge in and bash people with it. And then you have two abilities that help you with that. And a general good ability. But overall, it's not his worst work, but it definitely needs a lot of work. It is not as bad as his shaman. But with that being said, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. In the next episode, I'll actually go over his next subclasses for this, because believe it or not only did he charge you money for this one, he charges you money for additional subclasses he releases later, which, if these are any indication, aren't gonna be much better. If it can match Shield, we'll be okay. But I will see you all in the next episode. Latest.